Thank you for your interest in the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation. My name is Dr. Zak Leonard, and I'm currently the Historic Preservation Manager at the Bluegrass Trust, or BGT. This webinar on the history of our organization is based primarily on information gleaned from Lexington Herald Leader articles stretching back 70 years, internal files, back issues of our Preservation Matters magazine, and interviews with BGT members. In the interest of brevity, this presentation will largely focus on our campaigns to save threatened buildings in Lexington, though we also service the counties surrounding Fayette. Additionally, we have offered many successful educational and homeowner assistance programs over the years. Founded in 1955, the Bluegrass Trust was initially known as the Foundation for the Preservation of Historic Lexington. What, might you ask, was the impetus for the establishment of the organization? Well, that would be the destruction of the John Bradford House at the southwest corner of 2nd and Mill. Bradford was the founder of the Kentucky Gazette, which was the second newspaper west of the Alleghenies and the first in Kentucky. He had purchased the property in 1806 from Thomas Hart and lived in the house until his death in 1830. The house was the scene of high-profile marriages between Henry Clay and Lucretia Hart in 1799, and between John Hunt Morgan and Rebecca Gratz Bruce in 1848. It was also the home of Laura Clay, the suffragette daughter of Cassius Clay. In the 1950s, the building was demolished by a developer named R.A. Welch, who also owned the neighboring Hunt Morgan house that he claimed was disintegrating. In response to this imminent threat, a group of intrepid citizens led by Joseph C. Graves Sr. took out a mortgage to buy the $40,000 Hunt Morgan house, which was historically known as Hopemont. So just a brief word or two about Hopemont. After the death of Henrietta Morgan, the daughter of John Wesley Hunt, who had built the house in 1814, it underwent numerous renovations and received embellishments. These included a 2-story bay facing 2nd Street, a 2-story porch facing Mill, and window elongations. In the 1940s, the 2nd floor was turned into apartments for Transylvania University students, and these would continue to be rented out during the 1970s after the 1st floor was turned into a house museum. And here to the right is the layout of the apartment. Almost all of these changes have been reversed by now, but some traces do remain. Beginning in the late 1960s, the Bluegrass Trust began an extensive restoration of Hopemont and removed later alterations. This scheme was based on a master plan drawn up by architectural historian Clay Lancaster. Following a carriage house and courtyard wall rebuild in 1978, which is shown here, we restored the portico facing 2nd Street using craftsmen from Paris, Kentucky. Governor Julian Carroll offered $100,000 towards this project, which was estimated to cost around $500,000. To obtain appropriate bricks, we worked with a firm in Maryland, but we failed twice to fabricate ones that matched the originals properly. And to inform visitors of this, someone crafted the catchy poem that is at the center of this slide. And just look at beautiful Hopemont today. In the fall of 2023, we completed chimney, plumbing, and HVAC repairs, as well as electrical, AV, and data network upgrades to convert the building into a cutting-edge preservation resource center. In its first decade, the Bluegrass Trust was also involved in a particularly large project, the restoration of Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill. Although the site was abandoned, more than 50 buildings dating back to 1806 were still standing. It was thus considered to be the most complete Shaker Village in America. The Shakers there were experimental farmers, and by 1822 were developing Kentucky's silk culture and growing Chinese sugarcane. Their community declined rapidly after the Civil War, and its last members had passed away by 1919. Efforts to save this site began in 1957 following a meeting at Pleasant Hill sponsored by BGT, which took an option on the sale of the land. And in the fall of 1961, a subcommittee consisting of several prominent BGT members incorporated itself as the Shakertown at Pleasant Hill nonprofit. Much of the early work at Shakertown was spearheaded by Earl D. Wallace, a former oil executive and financier. Wallace was instrumental in securing a $2 million loan from the Area Redevelopment Administration of the Department of Commerce. And the Lilly Endowment Foundation also provided seed money for Shakertown's revival. By 1977, 140,000 tourists were visiting the site annually. Now let us move back to Lexington, right down the street from Hopemont, in fact. In 1965, the First Presbyterian Church on Mill purchased the Henry Clay Law Office. Built in 1803 as a one-story structure, it was expanded in the 1830s, and an extra floor was added. However, Clay Lancaster determined that the original building was still intact within. In 1968, the church voted to demolish it for parking and to make room for expansion. However, it accepted a 90-day demolition delay and gave the BGT 6 months to consider the feasibility of moving it brick by brick. Still, the church rejected BGT's offer to buy the building for $10,000 and manage it for 50 years. The debate also started an editorial war in the Herald Leader. According to one critic, in its effort to save so many buildings, the Bluegrass Trust has spread itself too thin over too many projects. But in the spring of 1969, the State Commissioner of Finance brought a suit against the church and threatened to start condemnation proceedings to save the law office. The church finally relented and sold it to the Commonwealth for about $25,000, which then conveyed it to the Kentucky Heritage Foundation. Robert McMeekin, a local architect renowned for his colonial revival houses, oversaw the project, while Clay Lancaster participated as a consultant. BGT then obtained ownership of the law office in November 1969 and completed the restoration by 1973. And its unveiling is shown here in the top right photo. So now let's move a bit further south to West High Street. Adopted in 1965 and revised several times, the city's $10 million urban renewal plan called for the demolition of 128 buildings and the rehabilitation of 141. In February 1969, the city obtained title to 14 historic buildings on the north side of High Street and proceeded to sell some of these parcels at a reduced price to the Citizens Union National Bank and Trust Co., which intended to construct a complex for 1,000 employees. Before we delve into the Bluegrass Trust's opposition to this project, I want to briefly go over the laws that governed urban renewal. So essentially, the federal government would cover 2/3 of the project cost, the city government would cover 1/3 of the project cost, and a local public agency, in this case the Lexington Urban Renewal Agency, would oversee the actual site work. Per the 1949 Housing Act, local agencies could acquire and demolish residential properties through eminent domain. They would then sell this land to private developers below market rate. The 1954 Housing Act extended urban renewal to commercial properties as well as residential, and federal money could now be applied towards rehabilitation instead of clearance only. To be eligible for rehabilitation, 20% of the area had to contain building and environmental deficiencies. The category of environmental deficiencies could include overcrowding, excessive dwelling unit density, unsafe streets, and inadequate public facilities. For clearances, 50% of the area had to contain building deficiencies, or 20% of the area had building deficiencies and 30% was experiencing blighting conditions, which were basically the same as environmental deficiencies. The upper sketch here depicts the threatened buildings on the 100 and 200 blocks of West High. And the lower photo is of the 1804 David Dodge House, which received Greek Revival detailing in the 1840s. Properties slated for demolition also included the Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church, one of architect-builder John McMurtry's last designs, and the first structure in the region to feature poured concrete windowsills. To the immediate east of this building lay the former Hill Street Church, which had been converted into housing. The west half of this building was apparently William Todd's 1806 spinning mill, while the east portion was added to form the church in 1831. It was also the scene of a significant union between two of Lexington's early Christian sects. Also targeted was the 1784 Adam Rankin House that was constructed with squared, dovetailed logs. An infamous and somewhat fanatical preacher, Rankin created a schism in the Presbyterian Church by banning the singing of Isaac Watts hymns. As one historian put it, his enthusiasm for the exclusive use of psalms not only possessed his mind, but perverted it. His house received a two-story timber frame addition around 1794, which you can see to the right in this picture. Subsequent owners included abolitionist Lawson McCullough and his son Samuel. An antiquarian and mathematician, Samuel operated a girls' academy downtown for 14 years before inheriting the recipe for Nathan Burroughs' famous mustard. The Bluegrass Trust teamed up with the South Hill Neighborhood Association to fight this development. By 1969, the State Historical Commission had joined in the effort and even operated a satellite office on Vine. At the 11th hour, BGT placed the 14 buildings from the 100 to 300 blocks on the National Register of Historic Places. These were actually the first properties in the state to be placed on the register. To block the looming demolition, BGT then filed an action in federal court citing this designation. As an experiment, we also undertook a 30-hour instant renovation of the 1798 Morrison House and filled it with Kentucky antiques. But our legal arguments were not successful. In 1970, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to review the case, and demolition resumed. Interestingly, there is an interview with one of our presidents, Joseph C. Graves, Jr., that was recorded in 1980 and is preserved at the University of Kentucky's Nunn Center. During this chat, he recounts the High Street drama, and it's clear that he was much more moderate than other preservationists at the time. While he saw some merit in downtown urban renewal when he was a city commissioner, his mother, Lucy, was one of the protesters who actually sat in front of the bulldozers. This picture of Lucy was featured in a 1970 New York Times article by premier architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable, entitled No Time to Joke, that is a searing takedown of urban renewal. But returning to High Street, there was a silver lining. While the bank claimed it would integrate the Rankin House into its design, it ultimately abandoned this plan. In 1971, the Bluegrass Trust took on loans to purchase the building and moved it to a vacant parcel on South Mill Street. The goal here was to stabilize the house and sell it on with conservation restrictions attached. To do this, however, we required ample volunteer manpower and basically conscripted frat boys from Delta Tau Delta to grade the yard, paint the fence, and do other tasks. Some elements, such as the brick cube-shaped library that Samuel installed in the 1840s, could not be relocated. The Rankin House was sold at auction in 1972 to Alex Campbell Jr. for around $27,000. And here it is, protected in all its glory today. Incidentally, the Rankin House was not the only log house we relocated. In 1988, BGT volunteers disassembled, numbered, and moved a 1784 cabin from Parker's Mill Road to the rear of the Orphanage Society on 2nd Street. This cabin, which contains an original pegged roof truss system, saddle-notched logs, and tongue-and-groove ash flooring, was originally owned by Major John Parker, Mary Todd Lincoln's great-uncle. Although the main house is privately owned today, we are pleased to report that the cabin survives behind it. Since our founding, the Bluegrass Trust has been a vocal opponent of poorly considered demolition that would result in parking lot construction. But it is important to note that we were not always successful in our agitation. So I want to mention a few case studies, as many of the obstacles we faced are still present today. One of the first demolitions we opposed was the loss of St. Catherine Academy on North Limestone and Academy Ave. The city paid $100,000 to the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth for the property and had considered turning it into a new police station. Determining this was unfeasible, they decided to raze it. Although BGT got a stay of action, the mayor concluded that we did not submit sufficient evidence that the building has enough historical value to justify the city's investment. As we will see, protecting the North Limestone corridor remained a BGT priority over the next 50 years. Our next case of demolition occurred at the BGT's own doorstep on 2nd Street, to the immediate west of the Hopemont Carriage House. In the 1970s, the Thomas Hunt Morgan House at 210 North Broadway was owned by the Women's Club of Central Kentucky. Although the president of that organization informed BGT that there was no plan to tear down two adjacent 1838 houses facing 2nd Street that were built by General Leslie Combs, the club did just that without warning in 1971. BGT hadn't staged any campaign to save these properties, as we had taken the club at their word. The takeaway here is that the most efficacious mode of preservation is preemptive rather than reactive. In the late 1970s, the Bluegrass Trust was also in a feud with Transylvania University over the demolition of 3 historic houses on the west side of North Broadway. This is the site on which the somewhat new Student Center lies. By this time, the 1840 Lucy Collier School building had been condemned and demolished to provide more open space between the dorms. Meetings with Transylvania planners were unsuccessful, and the school refused an offer from BGT and the Historic Commission to bring in an expert to discuss adaptive reuse. Dot Crutcher, who was president of the Bluegrass Trust at the time, wrote some pretty cutting editorials for the Herald Leader. And this triggered a response from Joseph C. Graves, Jr., the former BGT president and now executive committee member at Transylvania, who thought she had gone too far in claiming that the university lacked community consideration. As he put it, providing the best possible education at the most reasonable possible cost continues to be Transylvania's most important responsibility. So, even within the ranks of committed preservationists, there are always going to be differences of thought about institutional priorities. However, I don't want you to leave this webinar thinking that BGT is innately hostile to institutions of higher learning. In 1994, plans were afoot to demolish several buildings for the construction of Transylvania's new soccer field at 3rd and Upper. This included the row house that legendary Madame Belle Breezing rented from 1881 to 83 at 304 North Upper, before she relocated to a building that lay on the current site at Transylvania's Creative House. While Breezing first worked for Jenny Hill at what is now the Marytop Lincoln House, the row house on Upper is the only surviving facility that she operated herself. Her grand estate on McGowan, now Eastern Ave, burned in 1973. At first, BGT received some pushback for wanting to save this body house. According to one editorialist, the Bluegrass Trust loses credibility in attempting to preserve properties that have no reason to be preserved, and will make it more difficult for it in the future to obtain funds to purchase the properties that should be preserved for a valid reason. Yet persevere we did. At a meeting with Transylvania administrators, a BGT board member presented renderings for adaptively reusing the row houses as locker rooms and offices. Transylvania approved of this plan, which was estimated to cost $700,000, and our successful collaboration was later recognized at a National Trust conference in Savannah. While we are on the topic of former brothels, I want to direct your attention to our campaign to save the Emery Hotel. one of my favorite buildings. This eclectic brick commercial building, with its rusticated entry arches and distinct oculus windows, was constructed at the current intersection of North Limestone and Pleasantstone Street in 1892, and originally housed Simon Wheel's Third Ward Meat Market. After it was converted into the Emery Hotel in 1927 and received a full third story, this business soon acquired a rather shady reputation. In 1948, proprietress Ethel McKenna Beale was arrested for permitting persons to habitually frequent and assemble in and about the Emery Hotel for the purpose of practicing prostitution. Aside from being charged with pandering in 1968, she was also convicted for tax evasion on 2 occasions. The Emery Hotel continued to offer low-income rentals until 1986, when Boston-based Lord Companies acquired the property. These developers were in the process of rehabilitating the 1916 Fuller Building into the Gratz Park Inn and had intended to use the parcel for parking. Concerned by the recent loss of 200 housing units downtown, the Bluegrass Trust and Councilmember Pam Miller intervened and convinced Lord Companies to create an adaptive reuse plan. BGT then reached out to the East Kentucky chapter of the American Institute of Architects, which offered the volunteer services of an architectural response team. Unfortunately, Lord Companies' creditors came calling before any plan could be implemented. The building was lost, save for a few ornamental stones that were stored at the central fire station and its distinctive sign, which resurfaced in a 1993 Lost Lexington exhibit. Rumor had it that Ethel stashed her untaxed cash in the hotel's walls, but this trove was never discovered. This demolition brought attention to the report of the North Limestone Redevelopment Committee, which BGT had helped convene in 1985 when the City Council set aside $20,000 for historic preservation initiatives. But the Emery was not the only hotel in the area to encounter the wrecking ball. The Italianate building at the southwest corner of North Limestone and Short was first known as Alexander House upon its construction in the early 1880s. After the Boswells reopened it in 1888 as the Clarendon, it was regaled as the newest and prettiest hotel in the city. In 1893, George Land erected the steel frame Leland Hotel on the site of the livery that flanked the Clarendon to the west. Designed by Aldenburg and Scott, the Leland was the first building in Kentucky to feature a new type of fireproof wall tiling. 2 years later, new owners Joseph and John Skane mechanically linked the 2 establishments. From 1937 onwards, the conjoined building was subsequently known as the Milner, Charlotte, and Henry Clay Hotel. Auctioned in 1961, the former Leland section was raised for a parking lot. Meanwhile, the Clarendon portion continued to house the famous Zebra Lounge until the 1990s. In fall 1994, the owners of the building, who had acquired it for $60,000, applied for a demolition permit in order to turn the land into a parking lot. The timing was unfortunate, as the Downtown Planning Committee had yet to issue its first recommendations. Although now Mayor Pam Miller and the Bluegrass Trust urged the owners to sell the structurally stable property to a preservation-minded buyer, their inflated $325,000 asking price was prohibitive. The LFUCG's 120-day demolition delay, therefore, was ineffectual, and the hotel was torn down in 1995. The following year, these same developers purchased the nearby building at 109 to 113 North Limestone with the intent to demolish. As they were not granted a curb cut for the parcel, these speculators planned to land bank it, with a rather unrealistic expectation that it might one day be the site of a new federal courthouse. Located on land once known as Trotter's Row, the circa 1875 building boasts a textbook Italianate facade, complete with hood molds over arched windows, attic grills, and a bracketed cornice. From 1887 to 1902, it housed a barber shop that was operated by Benjamin Franklin, a former slave and U.S. colored infantry veteran. After code inspectors initially approved the demolition, the Bluegrass Trust presented evidence that the building was structurally sound and eligible for tax credits. Moreover, we confirmed that the owners could charge competitive rates if it was repurposed as a mixed office and residential space. Convinced that reuse was economically feasible, the Downtown Design Review Board halted the demolition, and this decision was upheld by the Planning Commission. Here we have the Dunn Drug Company store, which was opened to great fanfare in a new commercial craftsman-style building at the corner of East Maxwell and South Limestone. This mixed-use development was the work of druggists W.M. and P.B. Dunn, and contained 14 apartments on the second and third floors, along with the drugstore, Woods Groceteria, and a clothes pressing shop below. It was lauded as one of the most beautiful and modern business buildings in Lexington. The Dunns spared little expense in fabricating their elaborate pharmacy, which featured a luncheonette with 8 walnut booths. Meanwhile, the 21-foot Sicilian rose marble bar for the soda fountain was supposedly the prettiest in the city. Beginning in the mid-20th century, medical professionals began to rent out the Dunn Building's upper units. In 1999, Good Samaritan Hospital applied for a permit to raise the Dunn Building. BGT leapt into action and, with crucial support from Maureen Peters, Joe Turley, and Mike Houston, advocated for its adaptive reuse by drawing up plans that reimagined the upper floors as medical offices. We also placed the Dunn Building on our inaugural 11th endangered list and identified several buyers who were willing to acquire the property. Yet Good Sam's administrators believed it would be cheaper to demolish it and construct a new office center in its place, although this never materialized. Recently, the University of Kentucky announced that it will decommission Good Samaritan by 2029. Talk about a waste of historic resources. On the opposite side of South Limestone, the 1835 Samuel Oldham House had also fallen into a state of neglect by this time. In fact, it appeared on our endangered list in 2000 and 2004. This is a highly significant building in that it was reportedly the first house built by a freed slave in the city. Oldham was a successful barber who operated a hairdressing establishment and bathhouse downtown. By 1839, he had encountered financial hardship and was forced to sell his property, which also included a smokehouse, stable, cowhouse, and never-failing well. In more recent times, the house contained an antique store and was divided up into apartments. By 2000, it had been condemned. The plight of this house really brought the issue of demolition by neglect into relief, as owner Edmund Karam owned 4 other properties in various stages of deterioration that also made it onto our 2004 endangered list. BGT even met with Karam and offered assistance, but the restoration never commenced. After much agitation on our part, the Board of Architectural Review denied Karam's request to demolish both the Oldham House and the neighboring Queen Anne at 239 South Limestone. In 2006, new owner Coleman Calloway undertook a massive renovation of the building, but he ran into his own problems with the BOAR when he started constructing a side addition without their approval. After some conflict, Calloway agreed to alter this section to resemble an enclosed porch, and that is how it presents today. In the 1960s, BGT became directly involved in purchasing real estate to save buildings. The first case of this was the Dudley Talbert House on 2nd Street that borders Houghmont to the north. Designed by Felix London, who had trained at the Architectural College in Sweden, this grand Italianate was built in 1880 for Maria Dudley, the granddaughter of John Wesley Hunt. Previously, the land reportedly contained Henrietta Morgan's greenhouses. In 1909, Dudley sold the property to Matilda Talbert. When she passed in 1945, the house went to the First Security National Bank as executor of her estate. It seems the house remained empty for some time, as BGT bought it in 1965 to safeguard it. We then imposed a 70-year conservation restriction on the building and sold it 3 years later to a Transylvania math professor and his wife. Aside from changing the property's zoning to R2 to prevent its subdivision into numerous apartments, this legal device granted us the right of first refusal. BGT employed a similar approach in the South Hill area, first with the Rankin House and then with other threatened properties. In 1978, we received a 3-year, $20,000 loan from the National Trust to establish a revolving fund. Upon acquiring these houses in South Hill, we would typically attach a conservation restriction to them and then sell them on. So what is a conservation easement or restriction? Well, this is a legal document that runs with the deed of the property. They are often worded to safeguard the exterior of the building, but they can also protect interior features as well. Some of our easements, for instance, stipulate that all alterations must be conducted in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Easements can be perpetual or be time-limited, and they specify the legal measures that the grantee, being the Bluegrass Trust, can take if the owner is not abiding by their conditions. Some easements also have access clauses that permit BGT to open the properties to tours a couple times a year. Granting an easement also allows the owners to take a tax deduction, as this action theoretically reduces the fair market assessment of a building. The state identified the 2 houses shown here as surplus properties in 1979 and sold them to us at a very low price. The case of 408 South Mill is an interesting one, as we actually obtained that building to give us standing in order to downzone that section of the neighborhood from business to residential. The success of the revolving fund depended on many factors, principally the economic climate and real estate market. So a downturn in prices following the renovations of the Zachariah T. Smiley and James R. Dodd houses on West High in 1993 led to the de facto end of that program. Even though we had exhausted our revolving fund, a one-time injection enabled us to complete one of our most celebrated rehabilitations. Around 1805, wagon maker John Stillfield constructed a 2-room cabin on land he had purchased from hemp manufacturer David Dodge, whose house at the corner of High Street was demolished during the urban renewal program. It was composed of massive timbers with interlocking notches, and chinking, consisting of stone and mud, filled the gaps in between. The house remained in the extended Stillfield family until 1913, by which time a self-contained one-story addition had been attached to the rear. In 1994, the owner of the now dilapidated house applied for a demolition permit. With a $45,000 gift from Jeff Rittenberg, we intervened and acquired the property. Over the next several years, we stabilized the foundation, replaced windows, and added new cladding. For such a small building, it was a remarkably involved project. We finally sold the rehabilitated house in 2001 with a conservation restriction attached. So here's a fun story. Historian C. Frank Dunn, who was writing in the mid-20th century, reported that John Stillfield's widow had buried her second husband on the property. One family descendant interviewed in 1969 told of other graves that were covered with concrete slabs. The 1987 Kentucky Historic Resources Inventory form even claimed that the house lay upon a Native American burying ground. As of yet, I have been unable to confirm any of these rumors that link these deceased individuals with the property, but I'm sure the truth is out there. Aside from purchasing houses directly and rehabbing them, BGT has also worked as an intermediary to aid residents and preservation-minded developers. Now I'm going to talk about 4 case studies that speak to this alternative assistance. In 1983, the Sayre School was keen to build a playground bordering the south side of Constitution Ave and was planning to level 4 historic houses. This, of course, was before that area was a local historic district subject to city regulation. To prevent this, BGT agreed to act as a clearinghouse, receiving the properties from Sayre and conveying them to parties who could move them. The LFUCG also offered $20,000 in community development block grants to subsidize this relocation and renovation. 2 frame houses were saved, while 2 brick houses were lost. Susan and Martin Ginocchio, along with Robert Hillenmeyer, purchased a double house that developers Matthew Kennedy and James Brand had constructed in 1813. The Ginocchios happened to live in another Kennedy property, the Showstopper brick house on the corner of Constitution and North Limestone, so they placed the row house next to it. A smaller house that stood at Constitution was also moved across the street. And these 2 saved buildings are outlined in green on this Sanborn map. Now let us move a bit further east. In 1866, builder and brickyard owner G.D. Wilgus purchased 11 acres of land in the East End. At this time, he was in business with T.C. Luxon, with whom he sold hay, oats, corn, lime, sand, and cement. This venture resulted in another partnership of a romantic nature, as Luxon married Wilgus's daughter Lucy in 1868. At some point between 1871 and 1876, Wilgus built this house at 357 East 3rd for Lucy, who remained the owner until 1919. From 1928 to 1953, members of the Stevenson family owned the property, which they likely rented out. Reverend William H. Stevenson was an African-American minister who, according to a 1910 Lexington Leader article, had built 7 churches in the past 2 years and has been the financial agent for the Freedmen's Aid movement of the M.E. Church for some time. In 1930, Stevenson conveyed the house to his daughter, Willie, who was working as a music teacher. Meanwhile, son Charles operated his medical practice out of a small office at the southeast corner of the property. In 1981, 357 East 3rd was sold in deteriorated condition to the LFUCG, which conveyed it to the Bluegrass Trust for $1. Prior to selling the building on to local developer Edward Holmes, who rehabilitated it at a cost of $70,000, we imposed conservation restrictions that would remain in operation for 75 years. To learn more about the Wilgus family, please do visit our newly revamped East End digital walking tour on our Toward the Historic Bluegrass platform. It is important to note that inclusion in a local historic district does not automatically protect properties against demolition. Owners can still apply to the BOAR for a demolition permit if they claim that retaining a structure is an economic hardship. This is what nearly happened in the late 80s when the First Federal Bank was considering demolishing 108 and 112 West High Street for parking. These buildings date to around 1835 and 1890, respectively. Interestingly, the Richardson House reportedly was only 1 story originally, and I suspect the entrance was centered as the jack arch over the middle window is a wee bit too long. So BGT worked out a deal in which we would take over the lease to the houses for 99 years. We then subleased the houses to a preservation-minded developer who renovated them. After a series of bank failures and mergers, WestBanco eventually agreed to sell the houses to BGT for a nominal amount in 2017, as they were looking to generate some good publicity. We then sold them on to their long-term lessee for the same price, with a conservation easement attached. And here we have one of our more recent efforts to rehabilitate a house in dire straits. Believe it or not, the house you see here is actually one-third of a larger building that was constructed in 1835 on land once owned by Colonel John Todd. In the mid-19th century, it was the boyhood home of Thomas Satterwhite Noble, a famous painter and first director of the Art Academy of Cincinnati, who is perhaps best known for his series of anti-slavery paintings, despite having been a Confederate veteran. The house then passed to the Yellman family, and matriarch Sophia divided the surrounding acreage and lay Blackburn Avenue. She also split the house in two in 1893 for her two daughters, removed the connecting section, and added two-story additions to the front of each dwelling. When the owner of the house died in 2008, she left a mortgage and no heirs. The Bluegrass Trust therefore negotiated with PNC Bank, took over the mortgage for a small fee, and expedited the foreclosure. We then purchased the building when it was sold at auction by the Master Commissioner. Our plan was to dispose of the remaining personal property, make the house presentable, and put an easement on it before selling it on to someone who could oversee the full rehab. And just look at the sparkling result. Also, just for fun, I think this is my favorite Noble painting. It's called Skull Wearing Wreath of Flowers and is currently owned by Harvard's Fogg Museum. Of course, the Bluegrass Trust's preservation efforts are not limited to Fayette County. In 2013, we joined forces with the First South National Bank in Stanford, the James Herod Trust, and the Crutcher Family Foundation to purchase the Willis Greenhouse in Danville at public auction. One of the few properly Georgian-style houses in Kentucky, the property originally included around 2,000 acres of farmland. It was constructed in 1800 for Willis Green, a Revolutionary War veteran from Virginia who had relocated to Kentucky to work as a surveyor. Green represented Kentucky in the Virginia legislature and was involved in 2 of the 9 constitutional conventions held in Danville that led to Kentucky's statehood. He was also one of the first trustees of Transylvania University. After Willis and his wife died, son John acquired the property. A judge, John served in the state senate and was the author of an 1833 bill prohibiting the importation of enslaved persons into Kentucky from other states. The house itself is famous for its elaborate paneling and neoclassical woodworking inside, which family lore credits to Philadelphia-based artisans. What is now the rear elevation of the property was once the primary facade, when the house faced Old Goose Pike. In 2013, the Bluegrass Trust learned only 2 weeks ahead of time that the house's owners were planning to sell it at auction. In a mad dash, we teamed up with the aforementioned partner organizations, obtained the property for $87,200, and placed a conservation restriction upon it before selling it on to its current steward. But the Trust's most ambitious purchase was undoubtedly the Pope Villa. Suffice it to say that it was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, America's first professional architect, for Senator John Pope and his wife Eliza in 1810. In its original form, it expertly reflected Latrobe's theory of the rational house and featured elaborate internal scenery and sightlines, along with a distinctive second-floor rotunda. Along with the Higgins Mansion and Lyndhurst, which are both lost, it was one of the core rural properties in that sector of South Lexington in the 19th century. Over its first 100 years, Pope Villa underwent numerous alterations and was adapted into an apartment house before falling victim to arson in the fall of 1987. To safeguard the charred house from demolition, BGT purchased it for around $50,000, a good chunk of which came from our revolving fund. In the spring of 1988, Charles and Ginger Schmidt, who owned Sunrise Farm on Newtown Pike, agreed to buy Pope Villa from BGT and donate it back to us. Over the next 30 years, we received a number of grants from the Schmidt Family Foundation, the Mildred V. Horn Foundation, the Kentucky Heritage Council, and the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet to not only restore the exterior, but also to document the house and conduct wallpaper analysis. While the facade of the building has been restored, the interior is still fire damaged, and as of April 2024, is awaiting a full rehabilitation, as you can see in the pictures to the right. Now we have reached the conclusion of this talk and have almost made it to the present day. I therefore want to give a brief overview of one of our most recent projects, as it attests to the kind of strategic partnerships we are looking to make. This is the pharmacy of Dr. Cyril Augustus Palmer, which he established in 1961. At the time, it was the only African-American owned drugstore in town. Palmer was involved in a host of civic associations and was also a prominent civil rights activist who was targeted by the KKK. In fact, one of his other stores was bombed in 1968, leaving him and his family trapped under the rubble for hours. After this traumatic event, Palmer retired from business. In 2016, the Bluegrass Trust placed Palmer Pharmacy on its endangered properties list after the Catholic Action Center vacated the building. 2 years later, we formed the Palmer Pharmacy Consortium, a diverse group of East End residents, preservationists, and city officials concerned with the property's fate. A $50,000 matching grant from the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund and approximately $500,000 in contributions for the Marksberry Family Foundation have facilitated the building's rehabilitation as a united way of the Bluegrass Waypoint Center. In this webinar, I've tried to present a relatively succinct overview of our past preservation successes and tribulations. Hopefully, you've learned something about the architectural history of Central Kentucky as well. As we are constantly finding new ways to make preservation possible, please check out our social media accounts regularly and do consider becoming a member of our venerable organization. Thank you.